Well, welcome everybody. I'm Jason Gourmet, the president of the Bipartisan Policy Center. Terrific to have you with us on this truly glorious spring morning for an installment of our Agenda Setter series. I think as you've received the emails, you're aware that we have titled this session, Pragmatism Comes to Washington. And whether that is a high praise or low bar, I think is a conversation that we are going to now explore a little bit in terms of what is it going to actually take to get this town moving again. And we really have a terrific opportunity this morning with the two gentlemen to my left, Senators Manchin and Rounds, are truly two of the independent thinkers and pragmatists on the political stage today. And what we're going to try to do is get into a couple of the issues that are facing the country right now and also think a little more broadly about this kind of essential tension between federal and state prerogative. You know, the federalism that has been at kind of the heart of our constitutional tension now for almost 250 years, and look at some of the ways in which, as former governors and senators, these two gentlemen are navigating that moment. Just a brief, I won't even call it introduction, but moment of history. Senator Manchin came to the U.S. Senate in 2010, having been governor from West Virginia for the prior 5 years. Spent a quality 15 years in the West Virginia House of Delegates and the West Virginia State Senate. He serves on the Armed Services Committee, Veterans Affairs Committee, Energy, Natural Resources, and Commerce Committee. Most important, I think, Time Magazine got it right. Joe Manchin, the outlier, I think was the headline. And so we're going to learn a little bit about what it's like to be in that kind of lonely, courageous, and independent space that we at the Bipartisan Policy Center also try to inhabit from time to time. Senator Mike Rounds has just joined us, victorious in the recent election. Prior to that, Senator Rounds was also governor of South Dakota from 2003 to 2011. Also a majority leader in the South Dakota State Senate, a small business owner, worked in the insurance and real estate industries. Senator Rounds also serves on Armed Services and Veteran Affairs, and then also on Banking and the Environment and Public Works Committee. While he is a new, fresh face for some of you, he is an old and dear friend to the BPC, having been one of the inaugural members of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Governor's Council, which is clearly a rocket ship to the Senate. So the rest of our Governor Council members are now fearing for their own futures. But really, it's great to have you both with us today. And Senator Manchin, I'm going to start with you. You have been quoted often saying things along the lines of, my worst day of governor was better than my best day as senator. But I've also noticed that you're running for office again. And so I am hopeful, sincerely, that this is in fact a sign that you think things are starting to move a little. And so I guess I want to just reflect on what your decision to double down.
Yeah. Well, first of all, that's Tom Carper's saying. I stole it from Tom Carper. And Tom often said, my worst day as governor was better than my best day as senator, and that's all factual. For me it is, and I'm sure Michael will speak to that. But with that being said, we got something accomplished. As governor, I got up every morning. I couldn't wait to get up, didn't want to go to bed at night. I wanted to do something, and I could do something. So I felt good every day. If I made a mistake, I could fix it. If somebody needed help, I could help them. And if it needed change, we could change it. Then you come here, and it's a whole different pace, if you will. So with that being said, how did I make the decision? That was a hard decision. I said, two toughest decisions I've ever made. One when Senator Byrd died in 2010. I just had been reelected. I was almost 2 years into my second term. In West Virginia, you're termed out, like most states, in two 4-year terms. So I had 2 more years. I would have hoped that I could have appointed somebody to serve that out and make a decision in 2012. I didn't have that luxury because Senator Byrd died outside the constitutional window. So I had to make a decision. And I thought, at least I look back, in that 6 years we were successful. We worked and moved West Virginia forward. We privatized workers' comp. We did things that needed to be done. And we prioritized. Our priorities were based on our values. And the state was in better financial shape. In South Dakota, it was run efficiently by Mike, and we were all working hard, and we were in good shape. And I says, well, at least I can walk away knowing I accomplished something and try to take that experience level and common sense to Washington. I didn't know it would be this challenging and could be this frustrating. So when it came time for me to make a decision, can I go back home in 2016? Would the people have me? And all polls showed that we were still in good shape back home, so we had a high probability that we could have been successful. I couldn't walk away with the same feeling I walked away from the governorship into the Senate and walk away from the Senate to go back. I'll be walking away from the Senate as I quit and gave up. And I started thinking, if I quit and give up, and I'm asking people that have a common sense approach, bipartisan approach, to get involved, it doesn't set a very good example. So I just didn't, that was me. And if it would have been, if I made a decision based on what I wanted, I'd have run again for governor and go back home. Making a decision on public service, I better serve, and if I am going to talk about it, I better walk the walk. So I decided to grind it out, and hopefully I can make a difference in sending good friends like Mike Rounds here, but also sending former governors make it a little bit easier.
All right, so Senator Rounds, just to kind of situate us in your own mindset a little bit. So we talk about the wonders of being a governor, but that's a tough job, right? I mean, you had a terrible recession, you had devastating floods. Here you are, 4 or 5 months into the discussion. What's the mood? Are you optimistic? Are you concerned?
You know, I'm more optimistic now than I was when we started. Working as a governor is the greatest job in the world. It truly is. I mean, every day you get up and you've got something that you got to get done, and you know that you're going to have a full day's worth of work, and you're going to go to bed tired at night. But the next day, something's up, and you know you can make a difference. I mean, you know you can get things done. You have the ability to move things forward. And, I mean, that gets things rolling. In the Senate, I think probably one of the best examples I can give, I would tell people, why would anybody ever want to go to Washington, D.C.? Because that place is just flat out dysfunctional. It's broken. Nobody gets anything done. They do a lot of talking, but nobody cares about results. And John Thune had asked me if I'd run for the Senate, and I told him no for that reason. John Hoeven, our other governor out of North Dakota, called and said, you know, get your butt up here. I told him no, and I told him for the same reason. And a guy by the name of Mike Johans, who was the governor of Nebraska and who was serving as a senator, had called and said, look, I know Hoeven and Thune have talked to you, but you really ought to come on up and at least meet some of the other senators. He says, I know the other guys have talked to you about it, but he said, just meet some of the other senators. He said, you're going to find that some of them are normal. and I went back to Thune and said, okay, let's talk. So I came on up. Johans was right. What you've got here, and what I found in the first 100 days, 115 days or so, is that there really is a group of people up here that really do try. I mean, they're working. But they do a heck of a lot of this and not a lot of this, because the system that's been set up is one that's designed to be very slow. It was designed by the Founding Fathers to be slow in the Senate because they didn't want to dump on the American people. The whole idea was that the Senate was going to slow down what the House was doing. What the Founding Fathers never thought would ever happen would be to have a regulatory process in place in which the true legislators today are regulators that have never been elected. And in that fourth arm of government, that group of, that body politic that's out there right now, they on a regular basis are the people that really impact the average American's daily lives. The regulatory process here has really become the de facto legislative body. And I blame Congress for that. And so I think one of the major issues that we're going to talk about, and Joe and I have talked about it, is that we've got to take back control of the actual entities that make the day-to-day rules that Americans are living with right now. You take a look at there's over 1 million federal regulations in the books today. They're making them at the rate of 3,500 per year. Think about how many laws get passed by Congress. So we have to bring this back into perspective.
Right,
so now you're hearing a little bit of a process.
Here we go. We're going to get to reg reform, I assure you, because I think you have a piece of legislation that I want to ask you about. But before we jump there, right, April's been a pretty good month for American democracy. You all unwound what was really, I think, a terrible situation in terms of the appropriate role for Congress in the Iran discussion. You've moved trade promotion authority. Revisions to No Child Left Behind have moved through the committee unanimously. Doc fix, right? This embarrassing, I think it was 18 your predecessors kicked that can.
I know it was $170 billion we already spent.
So the muscle memory of the system seems to me like it's actually a little bit different. And so I'm wondering, first of all, generally if you feel like that's true, but let's talk about what's in front of you now. So Senator Rounds, highway bill. You know, transportation has always been infrastructure, a place where the Congress has been able to move the country forward. What are your priorities in
I'm a
this
freshman
conversation?
senator, so let me give you the perspective from a freshman senator's point of view. Highway bill is critical. It should be long-term. It should give some sort of planning opportunities for people that are back in the States. I think the challenge that we're going to have is the resource necessary, and that's going to come out of finance. So they're going to be able to tell EPW, the other committee, how much money we've got to spend. But the other part of this is you've got a chairman in Senator Inhofe and a ranking member in Senator Boxer who have committed that they want to find a bipartisan way forward. That's encouraging. And they want to do it in such a way in which we actually become more efficient in the highway dollars that we're spending, which I think is going to bring people together. So rather than having the money that we do have going into reports and analysis, let's put it into steel and concrete. And if you start taking that kind of an attitude in Washington, that's a major change. So I'm optimistic about it. I think we will get a highway bill, and I think it will be a long-term highway bill because of the drive of the chairman and the ranking member. And I think that's got a lot to do with it. And I'm very hopeful that we'll get a bill out of EPW and hopefully out of banking in terms of mass transit. Together will really be an example of what can happen if you commit. You want long-term and you want stability in a program, which is what we've got to bring back to the highway plan.
I would say simply to that unless we're serious about a budget and budget reform, to get a budget, to get a 6-year, and when Mike and I were governors in the best heydays we had as governors, a 6-year highway bill allows us to plan and build so we can complete something. Without a long-term, 2 years you can't do anything, and it just can't build it into where you're going to do any type of long-term building. You can do patch potholes and do some repaving, and that's about it. So without a 6-year long-term bill, and that comes with a more balanced approach to how we spend our money. But the priorities, Mike and I were both governors. You remember we went to Philadelphia? Mm-hmm. In 2007, they took us to Philadelphia. 47 governors showed up at the Faneuil Hall. And we were talking about, we knew this recession, we knew the economy had slowed down, recession, and everything was starting to dip pretty bad. And they were talking, what do we think as governors? We went back in history and looked. You know, in the 30s, you had Roosevelt with the infrastructure during the Great Depression, and then you had, in the 50s, you had Eisenhower with the highway program. So it was just natural for us to think, well, this money that needs to be invested should be invested in infrastructure. Put people to work, gives you a return on investment, it's good. We know it works. History has proven that. We got here, and in 2009, what, $800 to $900 billion for the stimulus package, I think almost $1 trillion. And most of that money was spent on government. And it really made me sit back and take notice of what in the world have we become. We as a society become so dependent on federal, state, county, and municipal government that we had to keep it afloat or the whole system would have collapsed. So the majority of the money went into propping up government. Mm-hmm. It didn't go. We thought that it should have just been like 600 billion of that 800 should have gone to infrastructure. Maybe 200, shovel ready.
And the next crew coming up, I mean, our kids and the grandkids are the ones that are going to pay the bill on that. And they would have at least received the benefit. And what we tried to do was we tried to put it into the highways in South Dakota. I mean, that's what we did is we redid our highways, the bridges and so forth. But you had to be shovel ready and you had to be ready to go. So if you weren't going to be able to make that investment in a timely basis to actually impact the economic return that you wanted for the investment of that stimulus dollar.
Senator Mitchell, I want to talk a little bit about energy policy, something that we at the Bipartisan Policy Center care about a lot. And we're going to come to the Clean Power Plan in a minute. But if we could just set that aside for a moment. In the House, Chairman Upton has indicated he really desires to move forward with energy legislation that will be signed by the president, right?
Fred's good.
Fred's great. In the Senate, on the committee you serve on, we have Chair Murkowski and Senator Cantwell are also working closely together and talking about, and they used a word I hadn't heard in a while. I didn't know we were allowed to use it anymore. Comprehensive legislation. Now that used to be a good word. You just say comprehensive, everyone would think by definition you're thinking broadly. Then it became a very, very bad word. Now it's probably somewhere in the middle, but it was the first time I'd actually heard a legislator say we want a broad. Sure. What do you think the committee can do? What could be in that kind of legislation?
What we deal with, and first of all, I come from West Virginia, energy producing state. We produce about 70% of our energy that we produce goes out to you all in different parts of the East Coast. So we're a net producer of energy. Most of it is coal production, coal generating plants. We have wind farms, we have turbines, hydro. We have a little bit of everything, so we're all in. So I was talking one day, and you know, Sheldon Whitehouse is further over on this side to the left on that issue, and Sheldon's always doing his climate change and everything. So I'm talking one day, and I said in the press, and Sheldon read about it, I'm not a denier. I believe that 7 billion people on this wonderful planet Earth have had an impact on the climate. We have a responsibility. Now, we can all argue to what percent and to what degree humans have played in the environmental changes in global climate. But to say that 7 billion people have not had any, I think is not being accurate or realistic. Sheldon heard that and came to me. And we were talking. He said, I'm glad to hear you. I said, well, no, Sheldon, I do believe, but I believe you're a denier, Sheldon. He looked at me and said, what do you mean? I says, do you believe that we can run this country or the world will run without fossil fuel? And he said, well, no, I guess it's not. I said, so if you'll accept that and I accept that we have a responsibility, let's start moving forward. So he and I start talking. And that made people say, oh my God, what's going on here? We got this and this talking about energy. The fact is this, you have to have a reliable system. And the reliability of the system means that when you want the lights to come on, when you want the heat to come on, when you want to go to work, when you want to do whatever you want to do, you have the energy you've taken for granted. We all have. And we've come so close to losing that with the polar vortex and everything that's happening because we are rapidly taking our reliable baseload fuel offline. The only two baseloads you've got in the United States of America today that runs 24/7, rain or shine, is coal and nuclear. Gas is coming on strong until we get the network of distribution for the pipelines, but right now it's not there. And everything else is ancillary. So if that's the fact, and then you have the fact that 8 billion tons of coal is being burned in the world. There's more coal being burnt in the world than ever before, and the United States of America burns less than 1 billion tons. So 7 billion tons, 4 of it from China, is being consumed and used. And so if you want global climate change, you have to have a global fix. We're doing nothing for global fix because we're not pushing everyone to go to the next technology that allows us to use the resource that we have in a much cleaner fashion. And 3 or 4 decades from now, our children or grandchildren might enjoy a total carbon-free. Maybe so. Maybe we'll have commercial hydrogen. Who knows? We're going to have something. But until we get there, don't you think we ought to use what we have without allowing the system to collapse or not being reliability? And energy independence is a big thing. You can't be energy independent in this country without coal. And you have to have natural gas, so you have to use fossil. I said, I'm just being realistic, and I'm talking about an all holistic plan. Well, you can imagine me on the Energy Committee from the Democratic side. If you look at all the makeup of the Democrats, and then you look at where I sit within that and tried to speak to them and says, I'm just asking for you to be open-minded about this. My good friend Maria Cantwell is a wonderful lady, but she comes from an area that basically she depends on hydro. That's wonderful. That's not how America's made up. The Midwest depends on fossil.
Fossil, and we've got hydro as well, but we don't want to see the base, the firm power taken away without a plan to replace it. So Joe and I think a lot alike in this particular case. We just want a common sense approach to how we're going to provide for the energy needs for the next generation. And you can't do that by simply walking away from that base and then expect the American people to literally increase the total amount that they're going to pay for their ongoing electrical needs over an extended period of time. I mean, this is a major issue, and it will impact our economy. And what I'd prefer to do is to have a very, very strong economy and be able to address the issues concerning climate change. I'm one of the guys also that says, look, I don't think it's a case of where you walk in and say, none of us believes that mankind has an impact on the climate. I think that's not the approach we ought to be taking. But we ought to be saying, how can we do something about it? And how can we continue to have a very strong economy so that we can actually afford to do something about it? And I don't think you can walk away from any one of the sources. I think you have to be looking at multiple types of sources of energy. Long term, you can't just rely on one type of energy at this stage of the game.
I think just in a nutshell, you just can't use what you like. You got to use what you need and use it in a more clean fashion and with technology, and we can do all that. We just haven't moved. I'll give you an example. Everything we've got right now, EPA is basing everything on carbon capture sequestration. We don't have one commercial carbon capture sequestration that's financially feasible in the United States of America. But yet we've set all our standards on that. That's a regulator setting something that hasn't been obtained yet. And that's the thing that gets us. So I've had pieces of legislation that said, listen, if you want to move and change the dynamics, then you basically should have any new technology under load, commercial load for 1 year, showing it can be done in the market system. It can be done in the grid. Once you've shown that, and if you want to change the dialogue, then go out and have new technology, put it under load, and see if she'll handle it.
So, Senator, are we investing enough as a country in that new technology? In other words, we have this wonderful
We're invested
energy
80 to 90% of every dollar we have towards renewables. Renewables at their best, with all predictions from anybody who knows anything about it, will get us maybe to 20%. What happens to the other 80% of the need of America? That's what we're seeing. I said, I'm okay with even 50-50. If you're relying on fossil for 75% of your fuel, for your energy, then only use 50% for research for the best technology. Use the other 50% to find the new technology. I'm fine with that. Doesn't have to be a ratio of 1 to 1, but 80 to 20, and you're depending only putting 10 or 20% of your research dollars into to the reliability of the system because you don't like it, and you're going to make it forced out of the system because you don't want to invest in the technology that keeps it alive. Perfect example, Mike, you might want to. President signed he signed the China agreement, right? There's an agreement with China. By 2030, China will have to reduce and use carbon capture sequestration. If you live in China right now, it's not CO2 that's killing you. It's particulates. Phase 1 of the Clean Air Act, we were able to overcome that with technology, scrubbers, low NOx boilers, bag houses for Merck. We did all that. We can do that in the United States. Why wouldn't he sign an agreement for them to go immediately into that to start cleaning up their air and then go into the CO2 by 2030? Can't figure that one out.
All right, so I want to dive now in.
We're excited about
well, that's
this,
what I
right?
wanted to get. There's an arc to an emotional arc to this discussion. We're about to hit the peak. So let's talk. I want to talk about reg reform, and I also want to talk about the comment, Senator Rounds, you made earlier about Congress kind of abdicating its leadership role to the executive. So talk a little bit about the legislation, but really try to kind of bear down on the mechanics of how a polarized Congress can play an effective role overseeing an executive.
I think, first of all, let's walk away from the concept of a polarized Congress and let's talk about a Congress that's actually decided that they wanted to get some results. Okay. And part of that means is that Republicans and Democrats have got to agree, at least in the Senate, that you need 60 out of 100 in order to get anything done. Based upon that, how do you move forward? I think you find some areas of agreement. Part of it is that there's always going to be a little bit of a rub between the executive and the legislative or congressional branches of government. I think now is a perfect opportunity with just basically less than 2 years left in this administration to look at what Congress should be doing in order to take back some of the role and the responsibility when it comes to the actual impact of laws and regulations on the American public. And we should do it in a bipartisan fashion. And let me just suggest this. They always talk about the states kind of being the laboratory. If you take a look at what the states have done, they've tried to hold back the regulatory onslaught at the state level by creating rules review committees. In South Dakota, just as an example, we have a rules review process in which legislation is set up to begin with where you allow the executive branch to create rules, but before those rules become effective, unlike at the federal level, they've got to come back and they've got to be presented back to a joint committee of the legislature, a rules review committee. The rules review committee can't kill it. What they can do is look at the bill or the rule in final form and say, is this really following the spirit of the law that created the rules process in the first place? And if, based upon public testimony and discussions right there with the people that sponsored the law in the first place, that rules review process can either suggest changes back or they can say, time out, you're going down the wrong path. We're going to hold this up until the legislature has the opportunity to meet and change the law so that we can have you go a different direction with the rules process. This is not new. This is not rocket science. It's been done in the states for years. How does that change in terms of what happens at the federal level? At the federal level, the agency creates a rule. They put it out for public comment. The public comes in and says, this is crazy. We don't want anything to do with it. What's going on with this thing? The same people that look and create the rule in the first place didn't get to decide whether they like their rule or the comments from the public. They then implement the rule, and it takes an act of Congress to change it. And it's got to be signed by the president on top of that. That's wrong, and that's a good example of the reason why the Congressional Review Act has been used once successfully since its creation. So there's got to be a better way. And if you've already got right now, you've got 1 million federal rules on the books today. They have become, in fact, the de facto creator of legislation in the United States today, and they are not elected. So whether it's a carbon rule, as a carbon rule, or whether you're talking waters of the U.S., which is what we're talking about right now, and changes in definitions right there coming out of the EPA through the Corps of Engineers, people back home, I've got a highway department in Minnehaha County that tells me, do you realize that if this law goes into effect, the new change in definitions of waters of the United States, navigable waterways, that literally if they want to take care of, they can't re-ditch. Heck, they can't even without a Corps permit, they can't even clean up the weeds in the ditches and the highways.
Let me just say real
It's gotta
quick,
be changed.
as former governors coming, we understand this. I was a state legislature, he was a state legislature. I was chairman of rulemaking review. And inevitably, at the end of the session, we'd have a 60-day session. Wouldn't that be great to have a 60-day session here?
40 days in South Dakota.
We had a 60-day session. He's a lead legislator. He passes a piece of legislation. It goes to the governor. The governor signs it. He goes home and he says, I passed this legislation and took care of your problem. Then all of a sudden it goes to, let's go to the DEP, Department of Environmental Protection. And, you know, who knows, by the time the lawyers work on it and they interpret the law that Mike passed and the governor signed, well, this shall, maybe it's a may. I don't think it's really a shall. Could be a may. I'm not sure. Let's write it this way and we'll see what happens. So before you know, you have interpretation of the agency that basically took the law that he wanted to fix something, and the governor signed it, and before you know it, boom, we have a rule, a law, and here's how the rules are going to do it. It comes to my committee now. I would do this. I said, Mike, I want you to come to this meeting because I'm going to be taking up one of your laws for the new rule they're going to imply. He'd come to the meeting and he'd say, Joe, that makes no sense. That's not the intent of what I passed. And I'm not sure it's the intent of what the governor signed, but I can tell you that's not. And I says, Mike, are you sure? And he says, yeah. So I would say, fine, stop, time out. This does not go into effect now. Send it back to repair it to get the intent. If not, it'll go back for legislation. We always said you should not be able to regulate what we didn't legislate. Why in the world do you elect elected officials if they can't do their job? That's all we're saying on this bill. So I'm happy to work with Mike on this.
And the nice part about it is it's not a matter of killing a regulation. What it does is it delays it with the threat that Congress would come back in and change the law to impact the regulatory process. Most administrators would prefer to work through that process in advance. And what you end up with is a better rulemaking process from day one, because there's actually a give and take in the informal part of an advise and consent process.
So I see the virtuous cycle, right? I mean, it's clear that Congress has not been in that kind of active, the oversight process when it was working used to do some of this. Now we have, look at the Clean Air Act, right? George Mitchell, one of our founders, wonderful human being, 25 years ago, led an effort to pass a Clean Air Act. Sure. We now have lawsuits upon regulations, and we now have a whole nother agency trying to interpret that rule. It's coming back, and we now are in a situation where the intensity of opposition is such that we have the majority leader basically saying, governors, don't implement. That concerns me. And I think the process that you're suggesting, to the extent that it actually reinvests the Congress in this process, seems very important. But where we are right now,
it's a rebalancing. It's a rebalancing of the legislative responsibilities with the executive branch. And hopefully it's done in a constitutionally appropriate way that doesn't take away the executive's authority to promulgate rules, but it does recognize that the actual act of legislating should fall under the congressional act, not under the executive.
So, Senator, do you imagine it would actually encourage Congress to legislate more? Because it was no mystery, right, over the last decade that the Clean Air Act was 25 years old, that it needed to be reauthorized, that it didn't contemplate climate change nearly in the active voice that we now have. And so there was, obviously, you both remember, a very strong effort to try to say to Congress, what do you want to do? And it was out of that gridlock, litigation, regulation. Do you think this process, in fact, would get Congress to move forward with multi-pollutant legislation that addresses climate change?
I think so, yes. But I think what you would find is one in which it moves forward in such a fashion that you would find a larger percentage of Congress actually agreeing with the end result. It may not make everybody happy, but it's like any process involving a legislative outcome. It's, you look at it and the end result may very well be sausage, and watching it being made is not fun to watch, but the end result looks pretty doggone good, or at least better than what it would have otherwise. And so you're always going to have some people that are never going to be happy with the end result, but it's better to have something that moves us forward as opposed to one in which you have absolute people disgusted with the outcome on one side or the other, to where you're doing the battle of trying to repeal. And the Affordable Care Act is a good example. That's one where literally you've still got every single day a discussion about what's the next step in the repealing process or the modification processes on the Affordable Care Act. Dodd-Frank is an example. You've got over 400 separate rules in Dodd-Frank right now, and it's about, 65% complete. If you had the rulemaking process in place where you were actually giving give and take on that and getting public comment and moving it through, I think you'd have a lot more people trying to find ways to modify it as opposed to taking apart different pieces of it.
We're going to come to questions in 1 second.
Jason, if you talk about, ask the people in this room, or ask anybody in America, wherever you might be, in any town, any state, the number one thing they think government is too intrusive. Federal, local, whatever you want. That's the biggest complaint that we hear. Everything, can't do this, can't do this. We stop them at every angle possible, And I've said the process should be, we shouldn't be afraid to do something because we should be able to fix it. In this process, it's slowed down to the point you're afraid to go out and do something, and whether it might work or might not, but your intent is good, because it takes so long to change. So you can't fix something, in the state legislature. I told all the Republican Democrats, I said, don't be afraid to do something. If you see something wrong, let's fix it. If you make a mistake, which you will, we can fix that. We took a real honest approach to it, and never blamed anybody. Just do it and let's fix it if it doesn't work. But this is not the atmosphere here.
So as we come to questions, I think it's fair then to say that, Senator Rounds, you're going to be introducing this legislation, and Senator Manchin, you're going to be co-sponsoring it.
We think a Democrat and Republican governors should be the ones to take the lead on this, because we understand it very well. And we've seen it work, and we can prove that it'll work.
All right. We've made news at the Bipartisan Policy Center. I got a lot more, but these are two great leaders. Love to have some interaction with the audience. Just let us know your name, and we have a microphone coming around to ask your question.
Hi, I'm Gordon Chaffin, and I do not have an affiliation because I'm looking for a job. Both of you have been governors, and so I can assume that you are empathetic to the president and his duty to have an executive office that works well. And so I was wondering what approach you would like him to take, his successor to take, along this process where you have a more shared role of regulation that is effective and that has more effective public input.
Let me speak just very briefly to that. I don't mean, I mean this, and I understand it. We came from the executive roles, okay? And to be successful in executive, on our level, governors, but they're all the same. Executive roles are executive. And the first thing, you never put someone on the opposite side, if you're Democrat, Republican, Democrat, in a position where they can't defend themselves or go home and embarrass them. You never ask them to do that. That's the first thing. Next of all, on executive privileges, I get people back home who says, well, his executive orders, executive actions, he overstepped. Let me just tell you, we all overstepped, okay? We did it, some of us did it a little differently. We knew what the parameters were, and we would move it, and we knew when it was politically difficult for our colleagues to vote on something. We'd call them in, Democrats and Republicans. We'd say, okay, I can do this. I'm right on the edge. I can do this. But if you want to take it, go ahead. You're more than welcome. If you want me to do it and I'll take the heat, fine. And there'd be a mutual respect, but you had that dialogue and you built relationships you could trust. That's part of being successful at leadership in an executive role. I'm never going to embarrass you. If you want me to take the lead, that's what I got. That's why I got the job to do. I'm the #1 person. And if it doesn't work, then I can go back and ask you to help me fix it, okay? I can do all that. I can take the lead better. And that's what I think, and everyone has a different style. President Obama has a different style, comes from a different background. And I'm hoping that the last 2 years here we see more of reaching out, talking to us, Democrats and Republicans that might disagree, and say, hey guys, on Iran, on this, what do you think? Here's what we think we can do. I'm here. I can go further if you want me to. I'll stop here and let you all take it from there. I don't see that dialogue. I think it'd be great if we did.
Got a question right up front, and then we'll go to the back.
Hi, I'm Stefan Grober with Euronews European Television. Looking at the ever-growing field of presidential candidates, we see a lot of senators and ex-governors. Wouldn't it be great to have people who were governors and are senators? Why is that something that we don't see a candidate mentioned, for instance? Why is that so?
It's a 2-for-1.
Yeah.
How about a candidate rounds
Well,
too?
Or senator rounds, for that matter. Yeah,
Look,
sure.
here's the part of the thing, and for full disclosure, I think Mike Huckabee is announcing today, and I'm one of the guys. I supported him in 2008, and I'll be supporting him again this time around. He's one of my close friends, and I think he'd make a great president. But I also know a lot of the guys that are in the United States Senate that are running right now, and I can tell you that there are some very capable individuals there. So from my perspective, looking at it, what I like is I like the fact that you've actually had a guy who's been in the trenches. He's had to face the issue of what pardons look like. He's had to face the issue of looking at a budget and saying, okay, how much money we got coming in? I mean, you talk about this thing here. We don't talk about the revenues coming in. We talk about the expenditures going out. But we've got a budget resolution that we're going to do just to get to appropriations. At the state, you've got governors that walk on in and they say, I got to balance my budget. How am I going to make this thing happen? And who am I going to bring to the table that's going to help me balance the budget? How am I going to make the cuts? And how am I going to get through this thing? And who are my allies on it? So you build that process in, and as a former governor, you have a chance to actually prove that you can work through that. If you can't get your finances in order, if you can't do that, you don't show stability to the business community, your economy is going to suffer. And right now, we need an economy which is growing. And in order to do that, we've got to have people believing long term that we're going to get our finances under control.
Let me just say very briefly to that. As a governor, I didn't come to the Senate as a stepping stone to run for president. If I was going to run for president, I wouldn't have become a senator. Does that make sense? So when I got here to the Senate, I came because I wanted to contribute and fix things, because I knew how it worked, or at least I thought how it should work in a very pragmatic way. So maybe we think differently. So all of a sudden we come here trying to make, okay, Mike,
We want results.
how do we make this
results.
craziness work? It doesn't. That's not how we run our states.
Yeah.
So we're thinking of that, why some people come here thinking, okay, now this is my step to president, and I'll start running for president first day I get here. I'm not saying about anybody for whatever their purposes and reasons. These are all good people. And I congratulate each and every one that's in the Senate now that's reached out to, they say, I intend to run for president, because I think it's a tremendous commitment that you're making and the sacrifice you're making and your family's making. So I congratulate all of them for having that desire. That our mindsets probably are not the same as theirs when they got here. I think that's it in a nutshell.
Joe, I got to just say this: that if we get a chance, we meet 3 days a week. We have conference meetings and so forth where we sit down, we have dinner together. I can tell you that if you have the folks that are running for president today in the United States Senate, if you could sit down with them at a dinner table and listen to them, and to have the common sense discussions that we've had, and to actually see them in a normal way in life, instead of what they've got to show on the outside when they go on out in front of a large group and try to build up that strong base, you would see what I think is the real necessary part of what it's going to take for the next president to succeed, which is a common sense approach in which you're not afraid to say, look, I don't have all the answers, and I'm not perfect in this thing, but we got to move forward and we got to fix a problem, so what's our best alternative? I see that at the lunches when we get together, and that discussion, even among themselves, which is something that I thought was very refreshing. And it's one of the reasons why I say these folks really are some very good people. But you don't see that on the campaign trail, because in most cases, you're focused on the results of that day and what the headlines are going to be that evening instead of the long-term result.
We have a couple of questions hanging out in the back here.
Robert Mahaffey with the Rural School and Community Trust, a proud resident of West Virginia.
Yes, I know.
In fact, I sit on the West Virginia Public Education Collaborative with the former First Lady, your wife, Gail.
Thank you.
Which is an honor. I'd like to talk about the amendment process in the Senate. We passed No Child Left Behind reauthorization, bipartisan, unanimously. And what we're hearing now is that it's going to get to the floor and it's going to be dismantled by amendments. Leader McConnell has opened up that process, some say more than the former majority leader. Mm-hmm. How do you see that process impacting legislation once it gets to the floor out of committee?
Great question.
Go ahead.
First of all, I think Senator Alexander has done the best that he can working with the ranking member on the committee to actually bring forward something which will have some consensus to begin with. Otherwise, it's not going to come out of committee the way that it did. But the second part of this is if you don't have the ability to actually suggest ideas, then you're not going to get a better product at the end. So like any legislative process, it is, I mean, it can be ugly, but the goal is that you've got to start someplace and you've got to allow input. You've got to have a debate on it. And if you have a healthy debate on those particular items, and you continue to push forward the idea that you're going to have an open debate process, now people feel more engaged in it and they have an opportunity to have a say. That's healthy. That's a positive thing. When you get all said and done with it, though, as long as they know that they're going to move forward and that there's going to be a bill and the process is not going to just stall, now people start to decide how much time do they want to do it and whether or not their amendments are really that important, or can they work with somebody else to find a way to maybe join 2 or 3 of the amendments together and find a common ground. That brings people across the lines. In the South Dakota legislature, about 15% of all the votes are partisan in nature. Up here, it's in excess of 70%, okay? But you got to have an open process in which it's not just partisan votes that you're having. You want more votes so that you can start to coalesce Republicans and Democrats, because the reality is a lot of the problems that we've got out there are not partisan in nature, and the end result of fixing them doesn't have to be a partisan answer. The education bill might be one of the best examples of bipartisan work coming together and common sense changes in this. I mean, there is no perfect answer to how to make the process better when it comes to education. We're all learning. And this might give us an example of how to move forward in other bills as well.
Yeah, let me say this legislation, first of all, it's the numbers. Okay, it takes 60 to get on the bill. We'll have 60 because we have 54 Republicans, and they're going to need 6 Democrats. They'll definitely get that. And if all the Republicans voted, and there'll be 6 of us, fine, it'll be on the bill. Vice versa, if all 46 Democrats voted for it, I'm sure we'd have 14 or 15, because there's that much respect for Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray both. They've worked in a congenial way. They've worked collaboratively. Their staffs worked well. They're moving something forward. So we respect that. I respect also the open amendment process. Now, Mitch can he can fill the tree and close it down anytime he wants to if it becomes excessive. But I think we have to go through this process. Keep us there a couple all-nighters. If a person wants to get out of their system, go ahead. We have earned the right to make a fool out of ourselves. And they ought to let us do it sometimes. So with that being said, we'll go through this process. We'll have a good piece of legislation, because once we get on the amendments, it's only 51. We get on the bill, it takes 60. Once we get on the amendments, it's a 51 process. So we can move that pretty thoroughly on that. Look at Common Core, how they demonize Common Core. Common Core did not come from this president, did not come from this town. It came from the governors. We looked at Common Core and we said, it makes sense. I want to know if I have somebody that can find work in South Dakota, had to leave West Virginia, their child is in the same position when they left West Virginia, they got the, and vice versa. That's about as simple as I can make it. And they have demonized this, that we've taken total control of the system. No, we haven't. I just want to make sure in 3rd grade, your child can comprehend, read, and write, and do some different math problems that they should be able to do in South Dakota.
There have been 3 more questions that have been up there for a while. I think the gentleman right there and across the aisle. We can try to get those.
Get some ladies there.
I've been trying.
Hi, I'm James Gelfin with March of Dimes. So I worked for the Senate during the debacle that was the super committee. My question is,
Super duper committee.
super duper committee. You got to do something about the deficit, the debt, the budget, et cetera. But how can that be done without hurting the least among us?
Number one, you can't fix your budget deficit. You cannot fix it without growing this economy. You just simply can't do it. So you've got to be able to incite and to bring in a sense of success to the business community to let them know that they're going to have stability. Next of all, I really think you've got to send a sense of stability in terms of tax policy. And I think you've got to upgrade our tax policies. And I'm not talking about substantial, revolutionary changes. I'm just saying some common sense things such as Section 179, which we put back in the last 2 weeks of a year, and you wonder why people aren't taking advantage of it throughout the year to actually invest more money. Repatriated dollars ought to be coming back into the United States. We ought to be fixing the things so that we've got money being invested back in our country rather than just in other countries overseas. There's a series of things, and it doesn't have to be comprehensive in nature, but you've got to make changes in the tax policy in order to build the economy. The other part is this: you simply have to slow down and you have to be able to reevaluate where you are investing the money. Social Security, It's on the horizon, and it's coming. But the sooner we address it, the easier it is and the less painful it is. You can make minor additional investments now that create huge opportunities in the future, and you don't have to make the changes as harsh as they would otherwise be. The other part is I will flat out tell you, there is waste in every single federal program out there, bar none. I'll give you just an example. You ought to take a look at the Veterans Affairs and what's happened just in their construction processes for new hospitals. One example, and then I'll shut up, okay? They started talking about a new Veterans Affairs hospital, a Veterans Administration hospital in Denver back in 1999, from my understanding. In 2009, they were in construction. It was going to be between a $600 and $700 million facility. That's what the VA said. Contractor said, you can't build this for that amount. VA said, yes, we can. And in fact, they actually modified the contracts. They went from a design build. They changed the way that they were going to build it. Contractor still said, you can't build it for this amount. Today, moving forward, fast forward, after reports coming in from GAO and the IGs, reality check, today that hospital, 2015, is 50% complete, and the cost overrun on a $600 to $700 million facility is $1 billion. Mismanagement, no oversight whatsoever. They got 4 projects out there right now, and every one of them, they're all major, every one of them is going to go over what the budget is. That lack of oversight says you can't have a huge bureaucracy without it simply isn't working. There's got to be a better way to do it. You can't have that type of fraud going on. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say fraud. Let me call it waste. And it is waste, because think about this thing. The $1 billion could have taken care of 200,000 veterans for a year. That's the kind of impact.
Let me just say, I think a tax policy that basically is fair and sets our priorities based on our values as Americans is what we're looking for. That means you have to have a system that people believe in. Right now, they don't believe in the system we have. You know, historically, we've done tax reform every 17 years. Haven't done one now since '86, so do the math. It's ridiculous. Things have changed. And people believe in America that if you have the economic wherewithals, you can do the long, extensive forms and hire the accountants and lawyers. You can take advantage of a lot of things in there that most Americans will never be able to. So the system is not fair. You should have corporate reform, and they said, well, we can't get corporate unless we do individual because of pass-throughs and this and that. But basically, it should be a reform system that we believe in. Now, here's my Republican friends. A lot of them have taken no new tax pledge. So we're saying we're going to reduce taxes, percentage-wise, but we might bring in more money if we get rid of the junk in the box. They're going to say, well, that could be this. You know, so we're having a hard time of a definition of revenue. So how can I let Mike go back home as a Democrat and not embarrass him? And he has to have a little win too. So if we said this, let's say we revamp our tax code, very simply, and we take the top 39.6 to 31, 32, 33. We take corporate from 35 to 25, 26, 27. We get rid of a lot of the junk in the box, and basically we spin off $1 trillion. We spin off $1 trillion. How do we able to maintain the programs that we have to give support to the programs that are in need, make them run more efficiently, but also what do we do with $1 trillion? If we said, I'll tell you what we'll do, 60 cents of every dollar, 60% will go towards debt. You can't carry $18 trillion. You got to start showing you're going to pay this thing down. The extra 40% will go into an infrastructure bank. Rebuild America. Everybody gets to participate, but you've got to give something, and it's just not going to be all the federal government paying. We have an infrastructure bank. Can he go back home now and say, okay, my Republican, I say, hey, Mike, you told me you said no new taxes.
No, I never said that.
I know, buddy. That's why you're here. But let's say some of we know that some of our colleagues on the Republican side are in that position. Could they go home now and say, you know, I know you might pay a few dollars more. Your percentages came down, so I didn't increase your rates. Percentages came down. But with everything said and done, you might pay an extra $1,000, $2,000, or $3,000 a year. Can you go home and defend it? And you're going to say, well, listen, what I made the Democrats, how I made them spend it. I'm not going to expand the programs. We're not going to keep cutting programs. But we're also going to take care of our debt and infrastructure. You know what most of them say? I can live with that. But we're not having that discussion with the president and the leadership. We're trying to, can we move it? That's what we've got to figure out.
Final question.
Florence Fee with No Health Without Mental Health. First of all, thank you, Senators, both, for coming and really support and commend your bipartisan approach. I wanted to draw attention to another excellent example in the Senate, where Senators Chris Murphy and freshman Senator Bill Cassidy are working together on a bipartisan approach to mental health reform in a really important subject that is health, which is bipartisan by nature, in the midst of fundamental transformation of how primary care is delivered to integrate behavioral health into primary care. So how could organizations like ours support and encourage this kind of excellent approach in the Senate to what is really such a fundamentally urgent, important, and bipartisan issue for the American people? People will not go to the only place people will go to get their mental health care is in primary care. And through integrated behavioral health, we not only improve health outcomes, we deliver value-based health care that is evidence-based and that actually saves money, because when you treat mental health problems, your medical claims and costs go down. So thank you for what you're doing, and I just appreciate any thoughts and advice you have.
Well, let me just suggest it. In South Dakota, we had a challenge on this back in the late 1990s with regard to how do you incorporate some forms of coverages under health care for mental health. And one of the things that we started out with, and it was a small step, but it was a major step, was to talk about biologically based mental illnesses. And we did it in such a fashion that there was a clear clinical determination. And it was one in which we could show that you shouldn't be talking about something that happens to the brain differently than something that happens to the heart. And we took that approach, and people bought into that right away. I mean, it was not a hard sell. But nonetheless, you have to take the first steps, and you have to work your way through that process one step at a time to bring that into full compliance or into full agreement. And I think when you have that type of a challenge where you've got people questioning what this really is and trying to understand it, take the steps one step at a time in order to integrate it into the entire system. I think it's easier that way, and I think you can actually measure your results. Remember, anytime you're talking about a legislative process, you're talking about trying to find a way in which you actually measure and you can show results. Sometimes it takes baby steps, and sometimes once you've taken a few of those, you can take larger steps. To me, it's a matter of integrating it into the system, but you still have to be able to look back at the guys that are counting the dollars and cents and say, this is the reason why you do it. There is a savings involved in it. Let us show you in a smaller step how to get there. And then once you've done that, you can take another step. And now you bring in the folks that have got to balance the budgets eventually. And now they start to become your champions as well. But it's a matter of building that coalition. And that is across party lines. And once again, this is a case of where this does not have to be a Republican-Democrat discussion. This can be a matter of show me how it works. Show me the processes involved in it, and let me become a champion for you.
Let me just say that I think that our returning veterans is going to make us change our whole concept of mental challenges, if you will.
That's a good point.
PTSD, almost 90% are coming back with affected some way. You know how we've been treating it up till now? Prescriptions. We throw more concoction of drugs. We drug up more of our veterans than Carter got liver pills. You want to know why most of them are unemployed? Can't get a job. So I'm on this hot and heavy because what I see is happening, and that's going to change America's perception of what we're doing and how we could do it differently. With that, then that goes clear down to prison reform, sentencing guidelines. Will you all get behind and not chastise him and I if we would vote to change the sentencing guidelines? We're putting a lot of our people who need mental help have been in prison. And we're putting them back out with no help whatsoever and wondering why their recidivism is so high. So I think through the military, through our veterans, and we've really attacked it through the VA, you're going to see us changing. And that will change. That'll bring, I think, more of a holistic change that's needed for us to be accepting that there could be someone in our family that has a mental challenge. Just don't give them a painkiller or a dart.
One thing we ought to also talk about on that for just a second, and that is the extended costs involved of fighting a war. Because when we take care of our veterans, that goes on for a period of perhaps 40 years before you actually realize the true cost. Our suicides right now,
Oh my, 22 a day.
Vietnam vets. It's not the guys coming back from the Gulf War right now, it's our Vietnam vets. And so, I mean, this is a long-term issue, and we're going to have more costs, but it's a cost that we have to commit to taking care of. It's not something we can ever walk away from.
If we
But
don't
we
fix
have
it
to
now,
figure
if we
out
don't fix
how to
what you
do it.
just brought up now, the cost to our children will be, it will not be feasible for them to handle that.